What if you took inspiration and turned a looter shooter, like Anthem, Borderlands, or Destiny, into a melee-focused looter slasher, more akin to an isometric Pioneer title, like Diablo? Well, that's what the developers behind the pixel art card game Duelist, we have already covered on the series, Counterplay Games, were interested in doing with their new AAA title, Godfall. A God of War, Monster Hunter, and Stormlight Archive-inspired looter slasher, launched back in November of 2020. Since then, it has been completely underwhelming and unable to attract a large, even moderate audience for a consistent period of time. Godfall would eventually be relegated to PS Plus, where it has found some smaller levels of success since. But what happened with Godfall? Counterplay's big chance at a AAA title. How did Counterplay Games potentially fumble yet another multiplayer title? On this episode of Death of a Game, we've got a developer returning. Not exactly something you want to see or hear me say to start the video, or at least you might understand the implications of such. Pay attention to the clues and evidence gathered along the way, detectives, as we put them all together for a final deduction at the end of the video to sum things up. I'd like to welcome back Manscaped as a sponsor again on the Death of a Game series. Manscaped is trusted by more than 4 million men worldwide for providing premium tools for below-the-waist grooming and hygiene. With the launch of the new Ultra Premium collection, Manscaped has perfected the 5 steps in 5 minutes, so I'll break them down for you guys. Starting with the conditioner, which cleanses and nourishes. This non-greasy formula is naturally hydrating and rich in antioxidants to revitalize the look and feel of your hair. Step 2. Once your hair is rinsed, pump the Manscaped body wash into your hands and scrub your entire body. The body wash gives a perfect balance of tough cleaning and soothing hydration. Step 3. Once you rinse off, you can apply your hydrating body spray, which is literally a spray-on moisturizer for everyday hydration. Step 4. Grab the Manscaped deodorant, which is aluminum-free, stain-free, and dries clear, to make sure you're smelling great and ready to go in no time. Step 5, we have the Manscaped Lip Balm, the final step, which is all about soothing and hydrating your lips. That's it, 5 steps make up the Manscaped Peak Hygiene Plan. Go to manscaped.com, use promo code nerdSlayer20 for 20% off of your order, plus free international shipping. That's 20% off plus free international shipping with promo code nerdSlayer20. Thank you again for Manscaped for sponsoring this video. Counterplay Games is the indie video game developer behind the pixel art card game that was enjoyable, though flawed, Duelist. If you want to learn more about Counterplay and their first major titles, check out my Death of a Game on it. But basically, following the timely failure of Duelist, Counterplay wasn't wanting to close up shop yet, naturally, and started pivoting onto what their next project would be. At the time, it was just teased to be an action game, which was likened to be a return to roots for the developers working at Counterplay, who had experience reportedly on Destiny 2 and Ratchet & Clank. Counterplay would be attempting to take flight, however, shedding their previous indie game title roots and becoming a full-fledged AAA studio, with new funding obtained from a video game venture capital investor, Kowloon Knights. They would still elect to utilize a publisher for Godfall, being none other than Gearbox. Godfall would be officially announced December 12th, 2019. Godfall was described as a bright fantasy third-person melee combat action RPG with a lot of loot to catch. Keith, who was again, like on Duelist, both serving as the creative lead and CEO for Counterplay Games. Keith would state that Godfall would utilize the Unreal Engine 4 and take 3 years of development time, as well as utilize around 30 developers before scaling up to 75 closer to launch, which was rather low for a AAA title. Keith and co. would state that Godfall for many of the developers at Counterplay Games was a return to action games. The weird thing is that I don't mention the experience they had on Diablo 3. Oh yeah, that's right. Keith Lee was the producer who got quite a bad rep from Diablo 3, and then went on and did mobile games before creating Duelist, as we mentioned, but shut down back in 2020. Well, after hearing about these experienced developers, I went and checked out the game credits for Godfall, out of curiosity of course, and maybe a little bit of healthy skepticism. After doing this on my New World Death of a Game, it's going to be a regular thing from here on. Keith Lee was the lead programmer on a few Ratchet & Clank projects, that and Duelist being his main experience. But let's start with the lead designer. Not a Ratchet and Destiny or hell, really a game in sight on the credits here. A lead designer who's never worked as a lead before? The lead world designer actually has some credible games he's worked on, and in leadership positions, even having experience, like Lee, on Diablo. What about the Destiny experience that was teased and listed on the development team? Well, the only person I could find in reference to Destiny 1 was this writer, who worked on Destiny 1 and 2. Meanwhile, the narrative lead doesn't have any other credits. All in all, the development set to work on Godfall was not only small in number, as mentioned only 30 people had done the majority of the work on the project, but also seemingly low in crucial AAA experience. It was going to be heavily reliant on the project's few experienced developers to really carry the torch and make sure things get done. There were questions swirling over Godfall and the supposed business model of the game. As with most looter shooters of the time, and other multiplayer action titles in general, Godfall was expected to be a live service game. The kind of game that not only do you purchase full price, also buy various season passes, DLC, and even microtransactions. The great news was Godfall wouldn't be a live service product. Instead, it would just be opting for a typical launch price and possible initial DLC. The bad part of that news comes in 3 ways. For starters, they were basically guaranteeing there wouldn't be future support for the game after a while, due to how AAA video games work. Secondly, it would come out just a few months later that Godfall would be required online as a game with a single-player campaign. The third part is a bit more intrinsic. When you design a video game, you naturally have to consider how to market and sell said video game. Nobody, in business, makes games for free. But Godfall not being a live service project and not having microtransactions meant that they couldn't even pay for more long-term support, which basically guarantees you weren't gonna get any. So by announcing that they weren't a live service game, they were banking on their game being a hit success to keep wanting to work on the game. But most likely the content would be released within the first year of the game, because as soon as the game's servers would be shut down, you wouldn't even have access to the single-player portion of the game anymore. Gamers reacted as you would expect following this news, and even went as far to accuse Counterplay Games of being misleading, as they would claim to not be a live service game, but still require online to play the game's offline mode. On top of this, Godfall was boasting to be the first PS5 next-gen console game, and the first to charge the increased price of $70 for the game on consoles. There were a lot of negatives that were coming out about Godfall that had nothing to do with the game quality itself. But regardless of that, all of this negativity was still affecting the game's publicity before their launch, which was set the following month in November of 2020. A date that Keith Lee would describe as set in stone. Godfall, and thus Counterplay Games' fate, was set. Godfall would launch on PC and the PS5 November 19th, 2020. Now, for the first time, players would actually have access to the game itself and conform their opinions on such, if they were willing to ignore the red flags shown already, because perhaps there was indeed a quality game behind all of that smoke. Godfall on PC would score a not so impressive 59 out of 100 from critics, and a much worse user score at 3.8 out of 10. Godfall, as described, was a looter-slasher title that took heavy visual inspiration from Stormlight Archive and Duelist, their previous title, with a high fantasy technology-looking game. Godfall would also take general game inspiration from titles such as Monster Hunter, Diablo, and God of War, which could be seen and felt quite obviously when playing the game. The purpose of Godfall, as expected, was to progress through the story and obtain loot that gets progressively stronger and rarer until you fight more challenging monsters. Which sounds like God of War, or a Diablo game, which is fine on the surface. But it's not just the inspiration that makes the games similar. Godfall combat-wise plays a lot like God of War, also being a melee action game. Keith Lee stated that Counterplay Games wanted to combine the skill-based combat of a game like God of War with the stats and gear of a game like Diablo, which is certainly commendable, but created a situation where, unlike God of War, Godfall is a far less guided experience, which doesn't do the game any favors. The parts that are industry standard, such as looting, going from zone to zone, etc., weren't half bad. In fact, Godfall manages to look gorgeous throughout all of it, with serviceable combat. But as Eurogamer would state, this is the problem with Godfall. Ultimately, it's all style and little substance. What makes these mechanics work poorly in Godfall, besides the abysmal camera that makes it just hard to track movement and even see what's going on, is the world and the story itself. The story, in essence, is told from the perspective of Oren, the main character, an outfit-changing and gender-bending protagonist who changes that based on which Valor plate they're wearing. Oren has a deep rivalry with his brother Macros, some former bigwig in the Valorian Council who he must try and kill cause, well, reasons. The story takes place in basically 3 zones talking to the same character. Paul Tassi from Forbes, who scored Godfall a 5 out of 10, dubbed Godfall worse than the Avengers game and Anthem. Tassi would also cite that the problem in Godfall is that it feels like the video game, with its barely there story and cloned missions. Tassi's closing statement was worse, where he would state that concerning his slight optimism about another title reference that we have also covered, The Avengers, that he did not share that same optimism about Godfall. The worst part about Godfall is highlighted by nearly all of its critical reviews, and I have mentioned a lot of the negatives already, so bear with me, is the utter lack of content and things to do. Even the story just consists of you running from zone to zone doing the same repetitive tasks, and then talking to the same character. Counterplay games would add an actual multiplayer endgame on top of the co-op single-player campaign. But as Tassi from Forbes would claim, endgame appears to be just more of this. The structure is different, you complete missions to get boons, and take on a final boss. But it's all just what you've done before at a higher level rearranged a little bit. In some cases, it's not even rearranged, it's the exact same level and missions from the campaign. So if you're hoping that the endgame would free you from the monotony or redeem the single player, you were going to be sorely mistaken. A full-priced $70 console game that has a single-player campaign that lasts between 12 and 18 hours with extras, then use that and copy and pasted the multiplayer on top of it all. Godfall not only felt rushed, it felt haphazardly cobbled together in an absolute crunch by a smaller than needed team. Which sadly, based on our earlier segment of the video, is what we expected because the CEO told us this himself. By the summer of 2021, about 4 to 5 months later, outlets like Kotaku were already dubbing Godfall a failure. Despite the rocky launch and lackluster sales, Godfall would continue on to have its first expansion, as promised, nearly a year after launch, August 10th, 2021. While the actual expansion itself would bring in new Valor plates and story content, fans were complaining about spending the now priced $40 for the game itself, let alone $20, half of that, for an expansion. Simultaneously, they would launch a free update trying to fix the majority of issues in the game, and add some new things too, like items and a new mechanic. But oh my god, why did Counterplay Games think that the player base, who hated the campaign, wanted to play more campaign in Godfall? Sigh. Sadly, they didn't. They told you that, and reacted to the expansion as you would expect. Especially because to experience the content, you had to level up your character, which means playing the story. Ugh. Godfall at this point was going to need to be free or have a subscription service to pick it up, to even have a player base period, such as PS Plus. Godfall would launch on PlayStation's subscription service PlayStation Plus, allowing a larger audience than ever before to test the game in a far more cheap and accessible way. Sometimes this can breathe new life into a game. They would then launch the Challenger Edition, which was the first expansion and base game bundled together. The catch was Godfall wouldn't be launching fully on PS Plus, despite it seeming that way. The Challenger Edition would skip straight to the endgame with a max level character boost and bypass the story altogether. CPG would then charge $15 to buy the upgraded version of the game, which would include the story content. Fans felt like they were just getting a sneak peek of the game, or a demo, instead of the game releasing fully on PS Plus. CPG would rebuff these complaints when they would state that Godfall on PS Plus wasn't a trial or demo, much to the overall frustration and annoyance of the player base, proving to be completely tone-deaf to it all. Godfall would receive over 2 million players following the transition to PS Plus, making it the most successful move for Godfall yet. The success would seem to at least convince them to put in more effort, despite the game not being a live service game. The Exalted update, which was set to accompany yet another edition of Godfall, this time dubbed Ultimate, would include all of the content offered in Godfall plus the new changes for the game, and launch on both Steam and Xbox for the first time. The Ultimate Exalted Edition would focus on what players had been asking for the most, and provide new in-game content. CPG would also attempt to address the combat system complaints, such as the action delay that the game suffered from, and the lack of variety in Valor plates, which felt like glorified stat sheets since they only basically had one ability each. Although the Exalted update was a quality update, and actually did attempt to address the biggest issues in Godfall, it seemed like too little too late for the jaded fanbase. CPG might have been trying to attract new audiences on Steam and Xbox, but their core game and core audience, changes or not, just simply wasn't cutting it for most players. Duelist might have had issues of not being good enough, with the other issues being more paramount in my opinion, but Godfall by contrast felt like a complete downgrade artistically, offering just about nothing unique or innovative in the space. It might seem a bit harsh, but if you read through this Godfall Ultimate Edition press post on Steam, and don't come away feeling like the CPG team wanted a pat on the back for trying to fix a rushed, lackluster game, as if that's doing something commendable and not what is expected. That just left a sour taste in my mouth. Game director Dan Nordlander from CPG would state, Godfall was a hugely ambitious game for us, which that much was obvious to see, but it seemed like it was a little bit too much too soon for the plate of the indie game developer Counterplay Games. I mean, Counterplay basically needed funding outside of the project to even function properly, which is why they met with that venture capital fund. The most recent updates and focus in Godfall is on the in-game content, which we would find out later on wasn't really the game in the first place. In fact, Dan would also state that Godfall was strictly envisioned as a story-driven single-player and co-op experience, which makes you feel like not only was the game rushed, it wasn't even the same game in early development that it would later become. What even was Godfall? Was it trying to be a single-player co-op game, like Dan said? To be blunt? If so, how on earth could it compete with God of War or Monster Hunter? Okay, well what if it's a looter-slasher title that you just play online? Okay, well slashing or not, it has nothing even close to what Diablo offers, or Destiny 2, or Division, content-wise, world-wise, and gameplay loop-wise. No matter what side of the fence that you put Godfall on, like the Eurogamer review says, it just feels like the worst of both worlds. Well, that's the music, and boy was that fast. Sometimes a case doesn't take much to crack, and Occam's razor is the answer. There's no need to complicate things needlessly, and no need to waste any more time deducing the larger contributing reasons to the death of a game, Godfall. An always online single-player co-op focused looter-slasher. Didn't seem to learn from the previous mistakes and rushed right into a big project. The game felt rushed and was sorely lacking in content at launch. No understanding of their target audience or a sense of identity in general. The entire world and story is generic game, the game. The gameplay becomes boring and monotonous because it lacks variety and staying power. I was really rooting for Counterplay Games, especially after my Duelist video. I was a fan of Duelist and found it to have suffered from a terrible fate, or due to a lack of resources and experience rather than talent or art. I felt that given the right time and opportunity, CPG could impress the world with their next title, Godfall. Sadly, not only did that not happen, CPG in the process has ruined much of the goodwill and underdog reputation that they used to benefit from, and thus it's hard to feel optimistic about them doing another title, whether a AAA one or not. When you manage to make a game that feels worse and more generic than Anthem, also covered in the series, well, it's hard to convince your player base of anything positive at that point, especially while taking essentially no fault throughout. Thanks for watching.
For thousands of years, we have upheld the Vulcan traditions.